First lesson is from Isaiah 61, verses 1 through 3, page 1157 in your Pew Bible. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Our second scripture lesson for today comes from the book of John, chapter 9, verses 1 through 12. As they went along, he, Jesus, saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus. "But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming, when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam." This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, it just looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes opened?" they asked. He replied, "The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. Then he told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see." "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said. My friends, there are two types of catastrophic events that can change the course of a person's life dramatically and permanently. The first is to get sick with a major illness, and the second is to be convicted of a felony. Now, in our Lenten sermon series about Matthew 25, today we come to the phrase that addresses both of those events. Jesus said, "I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Thus, the dual themes of our sermon exploration today is about healthcare and criminal justice. Now, the first thing to know is that medical care was very different in the first century than it is today. Imagine living in a time when hospitals did not exist. In the first century, there were also no governmental boards setting standards for the training and licensing of healers or approving standard procedures. There was no FDA to certify which drugs were helpful and not harmful. There were no painkillers such as ibuprofen, no antibiotics like penicillin. There was no understanding of germs or even the importance of sterilizing instruments or washing hands. Health insurance did not exist. The whole concept of insurance had really not been invented yet. If you got sick, it was completely up to your family and friends to take care of you. The people who loved you were the first responders. They acted as the nurses and the doctors for most of people's ailments. If you got so sick that you needed bedside care, someone from among your family and friends had to take the time from their own work and lives just in order to come and to care for you. Doing this was, of course, a huge sacrifice of putting your life on hold. And it wasn't just for a little half-hour hospital visit to someone to cheer them up with a bouquet of flowers. To care for someone who was sick was a full-time volunteer job as a medical caretaker. The physicians and the healers that did exist typically would come to your house, and they charged a lot of money for questionable care or procedures that sometimes made the patient worse. There was so much that was not understood or was misunderstood about human physiology in the first century. Consequently, there was a lot of prayer and religious sacrifices that were made in order to try to influence the gods to make folks' healing endeavors successful. Sickness absolutely was tied to sin in people's minds, and illness was often seen as a consequence of bad behaviors. That is why in our sermon text today we find people asking if the blind man's parents had sinned. It was believed that the ill consequences of sin were inheritable. This was especially true with what today we know are sexually transmitted diseases. Archaeologists have found evidence that syphilis especially was rampant in the first century. This and other diseases can be transmitted from a mother to her unborn child in utero. Add to this airborne viruses that can be easily spread among a family group, or the fact that they're all eating food together from perhaps the same sickened animal. That could lead to a whole family group all getting ill together. And it makes perfect sense that the sin of someone breaking the Old Testament purity laws could lead to the contamination of food or people and bring on illness. But Jesus doesn't further the thinking along that line. Illness is not a sin, even though sometimes our bad choices help bring about our sicknesses. Jesus divides the illness from the behavior and focuses instead on the healing. This miracle of Jesus bringing sight to a blind man is a theme that is repeated multiple times in his ministry. And it is a metaphor for the spiritual changes that happen in our own lives when we turn our hearts completely over to Christ. Now, the second area to explore today is the role of prisons in the first century. There were two types of prisons. The first was debtor's prison, a place where you and perhaps even your family could be enclosed until you paid back the money that you owed to someone. There was no way to declare bankruptcy like people can do today. If it turned out that you could not pay your debts, your very bodies would be sold as slaves, or else you would need to work a number of years as a slave to your debtors to pay off those debts. Now, this is why in the Lord's Prayer the word debts was such a powerful word to include. First century debt did not just adversely affect your credit score. The holder of your debt could call for repayment at any time, and they held the threat of debtor's prison over you every day until the debt was repaid or forgiven. Now, the second type of prison that existed in the first century was the prison that you were held in between the time you were arrested and when you were put in trial. These Roman prisons were notoriously terrible. They were built underground, they were very dark and poorly ventilated, and they did not have good sewer systems. There were no such thing as private cells. Both men and women were chained together in large rooms, and assault and rape by other prisoners was common. There was no commissary to buy necessities. There was no food service. In this type of prison, your family and friends were your only source for food and clean water, both of which they would bring into prison when they visited you. Long-term incarceration was not practiced. You were in this terrible dark prison until your trial, at which time you were either found innocent and released, or guilty and executed or beaten or whipped. Jesus himself at this first trial was sentenced to be whipped, and then he was sentenced to death by crucifixion at his second trial. You see, a life sentence in a Roman prison was not an option. So what does all of this mean for us here today? What about our own healthcare systems? What about our own prisons? Today, the problems with our healthcare system in the United States are well documented. While other countries around the world have moved to simplified universal healthcare systems, here in the U.S. we still rely on our maze of insurance programs and benefits, coverage options, and supplemental insurance plans to pay for healthcare. The opportunities for mismanagement, discrimination, and unequal access are colossal. They're widespread. Cost control is also a huge problem. It is no secret that charges for drugs and hospital care have now reached astronomical heights. They're unaffordable for many people. In the past, many Christian denominations have committed themselves to Matthew 25 and caring for the health of the sick by creating nonprofit hospitals. This is why you see so many hospitals with the word Presbyterian or Methodist, or in the case of a Catholic hospital, the name of a saint, such as St. Mary's, in their names. While in some areas of the United States, especially in rural areas, those are still in need of hospital buildings, the need for access to affordable health care for everyone has become the predominant issue for us, the 21st century disciples of Jesus. Now, the many details of exactly how to figure out how to do that is the task for us as Christians today. Finally, one of the most glaring examples of systemic racism in the United States is the huge disparity of incarceration of Black people compared to white people. Even though the Black population of the United States is only 13.4% of the population, in Michigan, over 50% of the people who are in prison are Black. Nationwide, Black Americans are incarcerated at nearly 5 times the rate of white Americans. While being sentenced to prison affects someone's individual life and greatly hinders their ability to find a job or secure housing after they are released, imprisonment also negatively affects the prisoners' families and children. In communities, it contributes to neighborhood deterioration and higher crime rates, and thus affects property values and the ability to secure loans. The mass incarceration of Black Americans is primarily not due to bad luck. It is the result of policies and practices created by a dominant white culture that promotes leniency and second chances for whites, and also maximum mandatory sentences for Blacks. The Sentencing Project which is working to reform our criminal justice system, recommends 3 major changes that would help to reduce the racial disparities in our prisons. Number 1, eliminate mandatory sentences and allow judges to have more discretion when determining punishments. Number 2, require states to create racial impact statements for all criminal statutes. Many laws on the books were designed by racists to support white agendas. All of our laws need to be reviewed. They need to be modified where necessary. And 3, decriminalize low-level drug offenses. People who are in possession of drugs and or addicted to street drugs benefit much more from a program of rehabilitation than incarceration. The recovery from addiction in rehab is not only cheaper than prison, but it allows the person more easily to return to being a productive member of society rather than struggling to find work and housing as a convicted felon. In conclusion, as we work together to follow the instructions of Matthew 25 to care for the least of these among us, let us remember that we are not only called to work for people's short-term needs of food, water, and clothing. We also must work together on the larger societal issues of equal access to health care and on the race disparities that are so evident today in our criminal justice system. Because, my friends, what we do for the sick or the addicted or the incarcerated, what we are doing for those neighbors is actually what we are doing for Jesus. May we truly love our neighbor while loving ourselves by working together on these issues. So be it. Amen.